Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to session number one of our innovation conversations. Thanks very much for making it. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Patrick and I. Before we do that, maybe very briefly, also because we're on a tight schedule today, we're going to try and keep it to an hour as much as possible. As you know, this is one of the series of innovation conversations we've been having throughout the last couple of years. And the idea is really to expose the organization as a whole, our partners, our broad network, to what's happening on different areas of basically social innovation, which is really what we do. We've had a long series of this, and it's very exciting to have Patrick here today, who is the Executive Director of New Robotics. I met Patrick about a year and a half ago up at MIT, actually, when we held a very interesting workshop, trying to coordinate the work of some of the agencies that were working on the use of drones, particularly in humanitarian type settings. Lots of good learning, and I thought it was a really
Martin Ross, I work with the Climate Disaster and Energy team.
Christina Raffaelli, Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office.
John Paul Parmigiani, I work with the Impact Hub Network.
I'm an independent consultant. I work at City Harvest.
Yeah, Brad Joseph. I'm with the special advisor with the University of Oklahoma and was previously with the UN for more than 30 years, working on social economic development.
Thank you very much. It's a good cross-cut. We've got UN agencies, we've got external partners, and without further ado, Patrick, take it away. Thanks very much for making the time.
Thank you all for choosing to spend lunch here as opposed to somewhere else. I really appreciate it. I know how incredibly busy everybody is, so thanks for...
And nobody brought lunch, which is a classic. No one ever shows up with their lunch.
We're fasting today. So as you know, the topic obviously here is definitely innovation, and I was asked by Benjamin and Bernardo to speak about the work that we're doing at We Robotics and the application of various different robotic solutions across different social good sectors, and we'll give you some very concrete examples of this kind of work. And what I'd really love to do is have this discussion be a springboard for further discussions around really actually doing something, collaborating directly. I think there are a number of low-hanging fruits that can be grasped in order to actually start the process and to really help UNDP as a whole consider more seriously how to leverage robotic solutions to really, frankly, scale the positive impact of your own work. That's what's so exciting about robotic solutions, is that there are some tremendous gains in productivity and efficiencies, as well as new capabilities that these technologies offer that simply were not possible 5 years ago. And I think it behooves us to really think about how do we make best use of these emerging technologies in a way that's effective but also responsible and ethical. Let's see how this works. Yes. So what I actually wanted to start out with first was some art. So this is the work of a Cuban artist, Jose Rodriguez Herrera, whose beautiful, stunning art can really be truly appreciated from the sky. Because if you were walking nearby, or even if you're in fact actually walking on the art itself, you wouldn't know, you'd have no clue that the patterns beneath your own feet actually weave together to form the hopeful gaze of a 6-year-old child. So Jose's art really requires a different frame of reference, a different perspective, a different way of looking at the world and appreciating the world. And as we know, if we were getting a little closer sometimes to art, the patterns start to disappear, the beauty starts to fade away, the context is completely lost until, okay, this is a pattern, but is it part of a bigger pattern? What does it mean? That frame of reference is completely lost. So if we're looking to try and change the world, I think what's really important is to have the freedom of perspective. When we need to be up close to see the details and when we need to be able to step back. And that's really what, in many ways, robotics allows us to do, is have that freedom of perspective, because we know full well that certain patterns or issues, indicators of interest, sometimes only appear at certain scales, whether those are spatial scales or temporal scales. So robotics allows us to gain that particular perspective and gives us new capabilities that, frankly, would seem completely magical to people living in 1898, which is when this first ad for the automobile came out. And at the time, if you do some research in terms of public perception and public reaction to the idea of an automobile, I mean, it was something called, it was considered crazy. It was just lunatic. It was the idea of, what, you want me to let go of a horse that I actually know how to control? You want me to get from that thing? I mean, it was laughed at and it was ridiculed and really considered as being folly, right? But we know full well that since this ad came out, the automobile industry has literally transformed the lives of billions of people, have created new capacities, have really scaled efficiencies and productivities, has created countless new jobs as well as multi-billion-dollar industries. And I think what we're seeing with this rapid rise in robotics is potentially we're at the cusp of a similar transformative change as far as the world goes. And it's one that is really best characterized as a shift from manually controlled technologies to increasingly autonomous systems. So what some people are suggesting is now do away with manual. We can actually start leveraging semi-autonomous and autonomous systems, which was once the stuff of science fiction, but it's becoming increasingly possible today. It may sound like science fiction still, it certainly does to me every once in a while. But the fact is our systems, our technologies are becoming systems, interconnected systems, and they're starting to operate on their own. And if you've flown in a Dreamliner recently, I mean, that's already semi-autonomous. I have some really good pilots, friends of mine, who basically say it's push buttons and you just look at the screen, right? And it basically can land itself and so on, but the pilots are there for public perception, reassurance, and so on. So the big deal here is not actually ultimately that these systems drive or that they fly or that they swim. The real disruption here, and why I think it's so exciting for us in the humanitarian development and nature conservation, public health space, and so on, is because these systems now can be made to be more autonomous than ever before. And that allows us to do a lot more, allows us to gain efficiency scales and productivity scales that are seemingly magical. So they allow us to do things we couldn't do before. They are a driver of new jobs and new markets. Now, at the same time, the World Economic Forum has coined this idea of the fourth industrial revolution, which it describes as basically being powered by autonomous systems, about robotics and AI coming together to basically create the next major industrial disruption. And as we know full well from previous technology revolutions, there are going to be multiple divides between those who have and those who have not. We know about the digital divide. I think we're going to see the same thing in terms of robotics divide. So what are we going to do about that as a community that's really obviously has a mandate to improve the world and get people out of poverty and reduce suffering and so on? We need to find a way to channel these technologies or to make these robotic solutions accessible to the global south as well. It's happening in the global north. I mean, you look at the top 500 Fortune companies, they're all over AI and robotics because they're saving literally, as Amazon is doing, is literally saving billions of dollars every year whether automated warehouse management robotic solutions. We're never going to go back to a world where we're going to look for more, unfortunately, for better or worse, for more manual, right? There's just too many incentives going towards the direction of autonomy. So what my team and I, We Robotics, want to do in our own small way is try and democratize the fourth industrial revolution, try and see these technologies in developing countries and help create local jobs focused on robotics and help incubate local companies that can start providing these kinds of robotic services so that you're not flying a team from the US or Australia or from Europe to go and do robotics projects with UNDP in Nepal. You're actually hiring Nepali robotics experts who have been trained and certified and who have the technology, they speak the language, they know their country, they already have relationships. That avoids a lot of problems. So this is how we do it. We do it through our flying labs. These are local innovation labs that are run entirely by local teams. It's in Tanzania, working on disaster risk reduction, disaster response, environmental monitoring, agriculture, and they work directly with local communities and doing community engagement in all their projects. And Khadija and Yusuf are going to be headed to the Seychelles later this year to continue a project there focused on marine life management, resource management, counting sharks and eels, and also looking at the impact of climate change on the Seychelles, on the atolls, better understanding how these atolls shift due to different climate conditions. In Nepal, our team there has also been focused on disaster risk reduction response, also environmental and ecosystems monitoring, agricultural projects and pilot projects there. And in terms of disaster risk reduction, the earthquake in 2015 triggered some 20,000 landslides. And this is one of the largest landslides that they've been working on because a lot of people have since gone back, they were displaced, are going back to those locations and rebuilding, but potentially rebuilding in places that are even more dangerous. And so we had an international humanitarian organization desperate for aerial data to better model the risks and to then create what we did, all Nepali-driven, these 3D models, to start doing risk analysis and risk modeling, so that now this organization, this humanitarian organization, is working with some of these local families and communities to actually relocate them so they're actually in less of a harm's way rather than more. In Peru, our Peruvian team has been working with the Ministry of Health to better understand some of the public health challenges in the Amazon rainforest. Obviously, in the Amazon, you don't have access to highways to transport medicines. Your main means of transportation is by riverboat, which can be very, very slow, dangerous, not reliable. So our team's been experimenting with low-cost, affordable drones. So you see, it's all scotch-taped, just to show you it doesn't have to be sexy, it just has to bloody work, right? It has to be appropriate for the context. And so this platform called Frankie, after Frankenstein, because it's completely beaten up, was able to deliver anti-venom to a village, which is now coming in to a very remote Amazon village. It would have taken a riverboat 6 hours, and Frankie did it in 35 minutes. So that's a huge difference. If you've got a snake bite in the Amazon, you don't want to wait 6 hours. We also did night flights. This was back in December. We've just gotten back from several more weeks of field testing in the Amazon at the very end of June. Did 50 more flights, 120-kilometer deliveries, diagnostic tests, blood samples, essential medicines. We did this again with the Peruvian Ministry of Health and one of the largest medical technology companies in the world that's very keen on complementing their ground-based deliveries of medicines with aerial deliveries because of the cost and the time it can take in the Amazon. So why are we talking about labs? Well, it's, for us, one of the best ways to localize this technology, to provide capacity building, to do technology transfer, and then to let go of control. We don't choose at We Robotics what the flying labs teams actually work on. It's quite on the contrary. They identify the main priorities, the main challenges, they identify the main partners, and then come to We Robotics, basically say, okay, how do we do this now? And then we come and provide the training, both technical and otherwise, transfer the technology, and they then take the lead in applying these technologies for those priority projects that they've identified. And ultimately, the purpose of this is to be able to collect, unique types of data, more high resolution when it is required, or high temporal resolution when it's required, in order to inform better decisions that can in turn potentially change certain policies and also help create local jobs as the demand for robotics services increases. We want to be able to help position these different countries in the global south to help meet that demand. We robotics alone cannot do that. We're already totally overwhelmed with requests, and I'll give you some statistics here. That's why another reason why it's so important that we help incubate a local business or local market of Tanzanian, Nepali, and Peruvian companies that can start meeting this demand. And we're not going to go after oil and gas projects, right? But a Nepali startup could. They are not necessarily limited to purely social good applications. Their bottom line is basically breaking even and making a profit. So these are some of the main activities that the labs are engaged in, and I'll unpack that a bit more in the presentation. So we already have 3 labs up and running this past year. So this has very much been year 1 of building the foundations of the labs, which means really building the capacity of our local teams there in terms of the skills, not only in terms of how do we operate these platforms safely and responsibly, but then how do you actually make sense of the data if you're using robotics for data collection, because you very quickly run into this big data challenge where you've got gigabytes worth of imagery, and manually analyzing this can take you literally months. So starting to now build more capacity and doing some more training as far as analysis is going to be absolutely key in the second year, and that's where we're looking to partner with a number of different universities that we already have relationships with to actually start looking at semi-automatic analysis of the data as well, using machine learning, computer vision, AI, and so on. In the pipeline for the next couple of years, we have Panama, the South Pacific Flying Labs, and Senegal are 3 of our main priorities. Panama will actually get launched potentially even by December of this year. But we're quite excited by Senegal as well as Pacific. And of course, the UN can leverage these labs, the existing labs and the future labs, but there's also an obvious opportunity for UNDP to select potential countries that are priorities and say, all right, based on some of the challenges there, potentially situating flying labs in those countries could be transformative as well. Just so you know, our overall strategy for the next 5 years. So we've already got the Peruvian, Latin America, the Tanzanian, East Africa, and Nepal, so South Asia. We want to be able to cover these different regions because ultimately what each of these labs are going to do is have a regional focus. And this is already happening in Tanzania, actually. We just held the first ever sort of regional robotics training, professional training. We had Africans from Uganda and Kenya, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere. We had over 63 applicants actually apply, and specifically for training on how to use robotics for projects and contexts that make the most sense in terms of East Africa. Just now we've got a request to potentially set up a Rwanda flying labs. And so our model there is not Patrick in DC going to Rwanda to help create the flying labs. It'll be the Tanzanian flying labs team who've already gone through the process of our framework, help seed and incubate the Rwandan flying labs team and create those linkages. And we already have some strong linkages with Kenya. They're also equally interested, as well as folks in Malawi and Mozambique. So that's our own scaling model. We Robotics HQ is too small, and frankly, we wouldn't be the right people ultimately to do this because all the skills and the knowledge and the understanding really is localized. It's within our flying labs and not at HQ. So we've done the labs, I should say. I've done 17 projects and trainings over this past year. And because we don't decide what they do, the labs have started developing their own sort of local flavors in terms of the kinds of projects that they're engaged in. And I just wanted to give you some examples of that. So with our Nepal flying labs, as a result of the topography and the terrain of Nepal, they've done a lot of work in very mountainous, high altitude areas that are really challenging to work in with flying robots. And they, by the way, just to make a quick connection explicit, drones are a field of robotics. They're aerial robotics, and the reason they're robotic solutions is because you program them to fly autonomously. You don't have to touch anything. And in fact, there are a lot of technical problems that happen because of human error, both in terms of manned aircraft and unmanned. In any event, so Uttam heads our Nepal flying labs in Kathmandu. They've worked on a number of climate change resilience types of projects. I've done some other little pilot projects, but these kinds of specializations are really what they've been working on as a result of demand for data related to these different challenges and sectors as well. And so, I mean, I should also note, as a result, the fleet of robotic solutions and software, less but the robotics are somewhat customized because of the challenges that Nepal Flying Labs team wants to address. So to give you a comparison with the Tanzania Flying Labs team, one of their areas is really large-scale mapping. So all of a sudden you see on the top right here, the Cumulus platform, that unlike the platform in the fixed-wing robotic system that Nepal has, which has maybe about a 45-minute flight time, the Cumulus gives you 2.5-hour flight time. So we transfer the technology based on the local challenges and projects that have been identified as priorities by the local team. So coastal monitoring, Yusuf is actually based in Zanzibar and has been doing some phenomenal work there with a number of different partners, mapping Zanzibar with the university and others. He's also done some work in northwestern Tanzania after the earthquake there last year. I'm losing track. So doing at the request of the Minister of Interior to basically 2-3 months after the earthquake to do an aerial survey of the area to better understand how the recovery and reconstruction is going. And now we've got some strong interest from the World Bank to do another full mapping of Dar es Salaam because of the massive flooding that tends to happen during the rainy seasons, and doing a digital terrain model, a digital surface model to better understand where the rainwater would go, and to then use that to start mitigating that impact. So that's something we're hoping to get started on really soon. And then, as you saw with Peru, they've been focusing on cargo, so the platforms are going to look a little different as well. They also took the lead, by the way, in response to the massive flooding in northern Peru in March. They were the lead group that basically organized a consortium of volunteers to head to the north and coordinated a very ambitious but successful aerial survey for search and rescue, as well as response and recovery and reconstruction. They went back in May to look at the difference between March and May and show the progress or the lack thereof. And they're also taking the lead on a really innovative Zika reduction project, which I can get into more detail if that's of interest. So our big plan, in addition to really starting to leverage computer vision and building the analytical capacity of our flying labs for the second year, is also to more directly connect our flying labs. They're already connected. They already have monthly calls just themselves without HQ involved. They already have their own Slack channels. But because of their different specializations that they've developed, they're in a really great position to train each other. So there are really big mountains in Peru as well. And there's some interest with the Peruvian Ministry of Health to do some projects in community mapping projects in Cusco, which is some serious altitude mountains. So in that case, there's no reason for Patrick to go to Peru. I wouldn't have the skills that Uttam and team have. You take the Nepali team and have them spend 2 to 3 weeks in Peru training the Peruvian team, right? And vice versa. There's a big interest now in Tanzania around cargo delivery, the World Bank, and a bunch of other organizations. Our Tanzanian Flying Labs team is interested in exploring this further. No reason for the HQ to go to Tanzania to do this. We'll bring the Peruvian team to do the capacity building. And as we move forward over the next few years, as the network continues to expand, we continue to connect the network to each other, so they become almost a self-help type group of information exchange, learnings, best practices, but also direct collaboration on projects. And this is not limited in any way to the flying robots, right? We've already had really great use cases identified both in Nepal and Tanzania with marine robotics, and we were talking with a group about doing something in Peru with terrestrial robotics. But basically, the framework for our flying labs already exists, and that framework is a way to basically localize emerging technologies in a responsible and effective way that is sustainable as well as create jobs. And so whether that's flying robots that go through this particular innovation pathway, or driving robots or swimming robots, the institutional framework is already there. And just to make it less abstract, at least on the marine robotics side, what Uttam and team have identified here is a really serious issue in the Himalayas. So obviously the climate change is having a very real impact on the Himalayas, making these glaciers melt. But what's also happening as a result is that you have, on top of one of the fastest changing glaciers in the region, you start having glacial lakes that are forming. And it's just a really bad situation, because what these lakes do then is actually accelerate the melting further. And there are literally hundreds of these lakes on top of these glaciers that are forming. And as one of my colleagues who's a scientist who studies this very closely said, it's basically these lakes act like a cancer for the Himalayas, just eating up the Himalayas from the inside out, accelerating the melting, which is really problematic, because there are some subterranean channels where these lakes are starting to connect as well. And so you're starting to have situations where some lakes overflow into some other lakes that overflow into the other lakes, and then you've got a local village that's further down, and all of a sudden they're faced with massive flash floods. In fact, the local villages refer to these flash floods as the tsunamis of the Himalayas. It's really no joke. There's some really scary videos on YouTube of what this stuff looks like. It's really very much no joke. So my colleague Juliana has been really racing to better understand, what do we do about this, to provide early warnings of future glacial flooding. And one way to do that is to better understand how deep these lakes are, how steep they are, what kind of composite materials the lakes are made of. And the way that she and her team of Sherpas are doing this is by using swimming robots. Same idea as the flying robots. You program them to follow a certain path, and you do not want to be in this lake. It's literally frigid. I mean, you would die of hypothermia in under a minute. So it's incredibly dangerous for human beings. It's much better to send a happy swimming robot to basically do the sonar imaging and getting all this data, which you can then get.
Here we are looking at the sonar, the depth, the side scan.
That's Juliana.
Pretty cool, yeah, guys?
They're like, yeah, it's freezing. So what we're hoping to do next with Juliana is actually go back to the Himalayas with both flying, swimming, and diving robots, because ultimately we want these diving robots so we can really get to the bottom of these lakes and look for these cracks that may not be actually visible from the surface. The earlier we can start identifying problems, the better. And as Juliana has really reminded me as recently as last month, that the aerial imagery is really, really important, because what they need to be able to do is model the banks of the lakes in 3D as part of their analysis, which is way over my head. So this is a great example where you want to bring integrated robotic solutions and have that also be community driven. She's already working with a local team of Sherpas and training them on how to do these kinds of readings with this data. We want to do the same thing with our flying labs there, and connect it to the university, and basically help them take the pulse of the Himalayas themselves and work directly on then preventive measures, mitigating measures, and so on. So I mentioned we're completely overwhelmed in some respects. We have more requests in this past year than we could possibly meet. A number of these have been great because they tie directly to our flying labs, and so our labs have been doing that. Other cases, the requests are not necessarily for full-fledged labs. In fact, many of them aren't. They're specifically, they want customized training. We just did a training in both Senegal and Haiti the past couple of months for humanitarian organizations, and in the case of Senegal, it was actually with the Ministry of Housing, property rights, and so on. So a lot of organizations have very specific requests for projects or trainings or policy research or feasibility studies. So that's really made us sort of think about how do we start trying to also address all these opportunities and demands. And so we've offered specific consulting services to anybody who's interested. We've already worked in all these different countries as a result this past year alone, with Niger coming up in October and China in November. But it's really a whole range. It can be on regulations, it can be on policy, it can be projects, and so on. Obviously, our interest is always to try and build capacity when we do these in any event. So what we're starting to see, and why we're choosing potentially Senegal as our West Africa hub, is because of the consulting project we did. There's such a beautiful opportunity with the data lab there that OCHA has been putting together, and other needs and so on, to actually situate the West African flying labs in Senegal. So these consulting projects also allow us to do some important scoping as well. I should also mention, and I'll share the link later, because of this increasing demand, we've also launched a roster of professionals, and within a week we had over 100 people, high quality people, sign up from dozens of different countries around the world. It was just in June, so we were really incredibly wowed by this such genuine interest in getting involved in robotics and social good aspects. So I was just talking to one of those roster folks, Denise, this morning about a project with the World Bank in the South Pacific that I certainly cannot do on my own, and so hopefully she'll be able to take the lead. So that's how we're expanding our capacity. Ultimately, just to close up so we have some time for discussion, it's easy to fixate on the robotics and the technology and the sexy new shiny toys and so on, but I can tell you just from this past year alone, robotics is the easiest, the smallest side thing. It's the capacity building part and everything that comes into that, and the planning and the permissions and the strategic partnerships and the media outreach and the evaluation and the data analysis, and that is what takes up the bulk of our time. Frankly, when these platforms are flying, it's boring. You're just twiddling your thumbs for 40 minutes until the damn thing comes back, right? It's not like, it's fun to see it fly, but after a while it does get a little old. And so it's everything else around that what we want to do, having learned this first year, we need to find out how to make that less painful and streamline that, make it more efficient. How do we help our labs leverage computer vision by partnering with Southampton University or other university computer science departments that they can work, or with EPFL in Switzerland, they can work with computer vision students who are already ecstatic to have the opportunity to work on these projects, do machine learning classifiers for Tanzania as part of their master's degrees. I mean, it goes from doing something that's abstract and handing in the paper to something that's really, really important and meaningful for them, as well as for our flying labs as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, but again, the technology is the smallest bit of the puzzle here. And just so you know, this is obviously far from a one-person show. That we Robotics, we have a really stellar, engaged board that cares far more about the work we do than previous boards and organizations that I've worked with. So that's really unusual, and it's something we certainly don't take for granted. We have a really also exciting cross-section of expertise thanks to this board. And this is just the whole team, so you have a sense of who's involved in our efforts. And as Panama gets off the ground, we'll be adding a few more faces soon to this as well. We have formal partnerships with the robotics industry. So we are not the for-profit sector. We're not the robotics industry. We are an independent, not-for-profit organization. But we have created direct linkages with some of the biggest movers and shakers in the robotics industry. That gives us access to their technology, to the technologies that they have developed before they even hit the market. So we get to, if we want, field test them to see if maybe this particular new platform may be helpful for Nepal because it's maybe optimized for altitude. So before they even hit the market, we can get access to these technologies. And it's a win-win. The companies get feedback on how these prototypes are actually working or not in some of these contexts. But in addition to just being able to have access to technology and software, it's also access to the expertise and the kind of customer support that we're getting, not from all, but from the majority of these. Is ridiculous. I mean, because they're so excited in the mission, they're just spending a lot of their time off and their free time just helping us when we have questions on the technology, helping our flying labs as well. So that's really something we don't take for granted. And then the different donors, obviously none of this would be possible without donors and various different partners. So Rockefeller and USAID and the World Bank in particular have really gone a long way to supporting our work and sharing our vision. We've done consulting work with the World Food Program, continuing to do. I was just in Myanmar a couple of weeks ago with the World Food Program, phenomenal project there. My other colleagues at We Robotics, Andrew and Adam, have been working with UNDP in the Maldives. They've been to the Maldives twice now, doing a scoping, feasibility study, and also recommendations on how do you build the government's, the national disaster management organization's capacity to leverage robotics technologies for climate change resilience and potentially waste management as well. So it's certainly not a one-person or a one-team show. All these organizations have played a really invaluable role in guiding our work and providing advice and connecting us to others. So that's basically it from me. If you're interested in learning more about the roster, just / roster. And the main way that we communicate our work is through our blog and webinar series. And all our webinars are then blogged about, and the videos and presentations are all recorded and so on. You'll see from previous webinars that all our Flying Labs coordinators have presented their work and will continue to present their work. And on August 15th, we have a doctoral student, a graduate student from the UK who just completed some really fascinating field research in Tanzania with our labs there, and then in Malawi, specifically looking at local perceptions, local community perceptions with respect to these flying robots. And I was just on the call with him for like an hour and a half yesterday. Fascinating, and so important as we look to bring and introduce emerging technologies in urban areas and very disconnected areas, paying attention to community perceptions and following a code of conduct that we have and updating that code of conduct is really going to be hugely important. So that'll be shared on the Google group and on our blog as well if you want to join or look at the presentation. So thank you, Bernardo.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was Thanks very much, Patrick. This was a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed particularly how you made reference to certain things that I think are very close to our heart here in UNDP. You mentioned South-South cooperation, capacity development, capacity building, testing with the user, looking to see what the demand is before you roll out a solution. This encapsulates a lot of what the innovation facility hosted by our Bureau of Policy and Program Support here does. That's why we have seed capital available to test out new things, including, as you mentioned, in places like the Maldives, and also doing some works with some aerial applications in Mongolia, for instance, on monitoring the environment. But I have a lot of questions, but I want my colleagues here to ask the question because I'm sure they also have them. So let me throw it open. I know Patrick has been kind enough with his time. We have till about 1 o'clock, at which time you have a hard cut.
You're being very polite. I messed up the time for this presentation, so I'm going to have to leave shortly after 2.
But we'll throw it open and let's take a few questions. Yeah, go ahead.
That was absolutely fascinating. As someone who doesn't have the first idea about how to operate a drone or a sweep, how technical is it? How hard is it to sort of train someone to use it meaningfully?
Great question. It depends on how ambitious the projects are, right? It's one thing to fly a drone on a beautiful day with no wind, no clouds, flat terrain. It's another to go up in the Himalayas and do that there. So our trainings our trainings typically last 3 days, but we have multiple ones for our flying labs because some of the platforms are different as well, and some of the applications are different. Like I said, doing this in the Himalayas versus doing this in the tropics or on the coastlines of Zanzibar or in the Amazon rainforest always brings new challenges. Even for our chief technology officer who's been doing this for a decade, it's not easy stuff that these labs do. But I would say we may be doing we'll be doing more trainings. If you want to join these trainings, you're more than welcome. Different trainings have different focus areas in terms of sectors based on the interest national, but I think within 3 days you'll have enough to go and then continue teaching yourself. But it really depends. If you just want to do video and manual, take half a day. If you're good at computer games, I'm not. It's a piece of power. But the more important answer is that it's becoming easier and easier and easier and easier. When I started flying several years ago, it was still a bit of a pain, and now it's just like, okay, click, 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 flies automatically, lands automatically, twiddle, twiddle. And that's what I actually wanted to get to, right? So Clay Shirky and some of his books a few years ago said, it's when technology becomes boring that it becomes the most impactful. So in a way, I don't want this technology to be boring. It shouldn't be about the bloody drone. It should be about the data or the cargo that's being delivered, right? It's only a means to an end. So anyway, long answer to your short question.
Yes. Could you elaborate a little bit on the analytical capacity? What's sort of the most useful classifiers that are being built? What's the data analysis around that? And who's benefiting from it, or what needs are there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we hope to get into that in this next year. The work that I've done in this space, I can also share one of the peer-reviewed papers we did a couple of years ago. That focused on Namibia, wildlife protection. And what we did was, this is with fellow co-founders of Robotics, before Robotics became public. And what we did was work with a local wildlife reserve. Obviously, in Southern Africa, there's issues around rhino poaching and all kinds of other issues. And so we did over 90 flights surveying the area to do population counting and so on. And then we worked with EPFL, with a graduate student, two graduate students there, who took the images and built classifiers to automatically identify animals. And but it was even more interesting because what we did first was we used crowdsourcing. We used digital volunteers from all around the world who each looked at one aerial image and they said, oh, there's a rhino here, or there's an antelope here. I mean, sometimes you can't actually tell what it is, but it looks like there's an animal here. And then we took the results, worked with these computer vision students and their professors at EPFL. And then we did the same thing for a project in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, where there was an infestation of rhinoceros beetle. So remember, Typhoon Haiyan was a Category 5 typhoon, devastated literally millions of coconut trees, which are a really important source of livelihoods for the Filipino. And to make matters worse, about 6 months to a year later, what happened was the uprooted, destroyed coconut trees started rotting, which created an infestation of the rhinoceros beetles, and then the beetles would go to the healthy trees and eat those up. So it was a disaster compounded by a disaster. And so what we did was work with a Filipino group, surveyed some of these coconut areas, and then worked with a computer vision professor and graduate postdoc at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And they did the automatic algorithm. So those are just two examples of projects that we want to do a lot more of, customized to the kinds of information needs that the projects that our flying labs are doing. But I'm not an expert in this whole space. That's why we're looking for experts like yourself, possibly.
I have a question actually, considering what you said about building capacity and working locally, basically, what is the lifetime of one of the lab, whether it's offline or, and in terms of sustainability, how do you recycle? Because it seems very easy, you fly like that. But so in terms of lifetime and recycling the parts or spare parts.
Yes. That's such an important question. So our plan here is between years 2 and 3 is for the labs to become self-sufficient, and if they so choose, become their own local legal entities. We're not kicking people out, but right now the labs are programs of Robotics as we incubate them and build the foundations and build the capacity and transfer the technology. But the vision here between years 2 and 3 is to start looking, and we've already talked to all lawyers in each of these countries about what it would take to create a local entity that's independent. Maybe Robotics would be on the board of this local entity, but the executive leadership would all be Tanzanian or Peruvian and Nepali. So that's sort of the trajectory in terms of the next few years. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, have those labs then incubate other labs in other countries when there's enough demand and need in these other countries. In terms of self-sustainability, we already cannot meet all the opportunities that are coming up, not just globally, but within the countries themselves, which is why we're incubating other companies locally. So, for footnote, we help incubate 4 local Nepali drone companies in April, May of this year. And we're doing the same in September, October in Tanzania to help build more supply for that expertise. But basically, it's fees for service. So a company or an organization, like UNDP, can go to the flying labs in Tanzania and say, we want to do this project in Dodoma, and we need to do this and this and this. And they hire the Tanzanian staff to do the data collection, to do the analysis, to do the presentation, maybe even policy recommendations in collaboration with UNDP in Tanzania. So it's not free, and nor should it be free, because we also need to be sustainable. And we're also exploring different models for renting out the technology. So if there's a person who's already been trained and has a certain level of qualifications, then that person doesn't need to go and buy a $3,000 drone or a $5,000 drone. That person can go and rent that drone for a nominal fee for 3 days, and that helps her or him then maybe launch a business. In terms of the repairs and so on, that's one of my favorite questions, because inevitably these platforms break. And what we've seen in one country, this international organization has acquired a dozen or so drones, and literally every month they have to ship them back to Switzerland to get fixed. And just the cost of that alone and the time is absolutely ridiculous. So we've been talking to our Tanzania Flying Lab teams who brought this to our attention. There's a business opportunity right there, whether it's within the Flying Labs or a company that basically starts servicing and repairing drones locally. I mean, they'll make a boatload of money. Why would you ship this stuff to Switzerland? So we're hoping, hopefully this fall, but probably in the spring, to do more training specifically within our Flying Labs in Tanzania on repairs, basic repairs. The challenge we have there is like with your iPhone or whatever, if you start opening and messing with it, your liability is your warranty goes out, right? And so we've had some productive conversations with several of our technology partners because it's also in their interest to have their clients not wait 2 months for the platform to be shipped from Peru to Switzerland and back, because then they can't fly during this time. If they have a business or they have a humanitarian project or public health project, it's actually really serious. So it's in their interest of these companies to localize the repairs as well, so that their clients are happy and can continue doing their work without being interrupted every time. So with one of the companies, we've gotten a good verbal agreement about how much we can tinker with the platforms before we potentially lose the warranty, and they'll let us do some of the basic to intermediate level repairs. And if we're able to not fix it, we're still under warranty, and they'll fix it for us. So it's experimental right now, but it has to happen. It's also not really ethical to introduce emerging technologies that can break and not build the capacity to actually do something about that locally.
Yes, we have a couple more questions.
Was there a question? I can go.
It's okay. We'll start with you, and then we'll
I'm curious about, I mean, since it is an emergent technology, have you encountered impediments to adoption, not by the operators who are flying these drones, but general community, especially when it's direct service delivery, so this is the venom, anti-venom. What have you run up against in terms of community perception of this technology, especially in like post-conflict settings, you have something flying over an urban area? And if your lab would be working on that capacity building or awareness, or who do you see as playing that role?
Yeah, all our labs do extensive community engagement and community awareness raising and so on. Yusuf, having seen him in action in person, is absolutely phenomenal. The time he takes every time he goes out to speak with the elders and children and women's groups and so on, with Khadija as well, who's playing a really important role there in engaging local women, is phenomenal. We have a code of conduct that we developed through a previous incarnation of Robotics with a Humanitarian Unity Network that we developed over a 2-year period of an open multi-stakeholder consultative process with dozens of humanitarian organizations, including the ICRC and UNDP, OCHA, and so on. And that's what we follow. It's what we follow, and there's a whole section of community engagement that we follow, and that Yusuf has been updating based on his experience, and also there's a section on conflict sensitivity, post-conflict applications, and that was largely written by the ICRC. And you'll see some of the guidelines there in terms of if organizations choose to use this technology in conflict zones, they read through some of the problems and challenges and dangers of doing so, and follow some of the recommendations in terms of risk reduction. Do that. We don't work in conflict zones. We haven't had a request to necessarily work in. We had Syria, but we turned that down. I don't think that's our expertise, and I think there are obvious dangers there, whether it's drones or mobile technology or anything else. I don't think we're quite equipped to deal with that, which frankly is unfortunate, because a case in Syria, which went to the highest levels of the UN, from the P5, was a perfect example of how drones could have actually literally saved lives in delivering medication, food, and water. But because of all the concerns around conflict and how Assad would potentially respond to this, would he then close the humanitarian access to ground-based deliveries, in defiance or not, people weren't willing to take the risk. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just sharing the discussions.
Thank you. I think we had a question at that end, and we have to, go ahead.
My question is very similar to that regarding the informed consent with the local population.
Yeah.
So have you been looking at any best practices in that regard?
Yeah.
Especially like international regulations.
So that community engagement, and please, by the way, I'm not if you Google Humanitarian UAV Code of Conduct, or if you go on the We Robotics website, you'll see it's also that we have like an infographic, a smaller infographic that we put together. You'll see, and I'll share it with Bernardo as well. It's deliberately a Google Doc, and you can provide recommendations on how to improve it. So not necessarily perfect. So this is an open plea for help and to help bring your expertise and help us improve the code of conduct. You'll see there are a couple bullet points within the guidelines on community engagement that speaks to the informed consent question. And you'll see examples of what we do to basically get the word out. So in Peru, before even taking any robot out of the box, we spent 3 days just doing community engagement. And that's what's after meeting with the local mayor, getting the permission. So the local mayor had local representative, if you like, at that very remote Amazon village. We first went to him and his staff and presented very formally what we were doing and asked permission. Can we experiment in delivering anti-venom to your village from this nearest town, 6 hours away by boat? And I still remember, his response was like, "We are honored that you're choosing us for your work and putting us on the map, and somebody bloody cares because we're struggling." So that was really neat, and we spent countless hours on local community radio station as well. Something the WFP did in the DR in Congo Brazzaville, which I thought was great, and we included in the code of conduct as a result, was putting out flyers as well. A week or 2 weeks before the project flying happens, just put out flyers and just say, "Hey, this flying is going to happen. This is who's doing it. This is the reason." Now, the one thing that WFP didn't do but should have done is they should have provided a contact name and contact number for anybody to actually call or text and say, "I'm a little concerned about this. I don't want somebody flying over my house." So those are part of the best practices in terms of community engagement, and it's essential. It's not a good to have. I have crazy bad stories of private sector drone companies coming in disaster response work and just have no cultural sensitivity whatsoever and are incredibly rude, and it makes our work harder as a result. They have no idea how to engage with local communities, and I always tell them, I don't care if you've got legal permission from the aviation authorities, not give you ethical permission to fly over these people's heads unless you start doing the kind of community engagement and buy-in. And ultimately, you want the buy-in because it's in your interest, because the folks with the local knowledge of the local communities, they'll tell you which areas have been most affected, which areas are at greatest risk, and they'll tell you, no, there's a mosque there, or there's a cemetery there, you should not. You won't necessarily know that. And even our local flying labs team may not know that when they hike up 12 hours north of Kathmandu to do these flights, right? So the local communities and the work that we do, the way we engage with them is as another partner in the work. And there's always so much interest from the local community in why this project is happening, who's going to be doing what with this with the data, and how is it going to help, and so on. There's always a lot of interest in this. And I think in part it's because Yusuf, Utam, and Juan take community engagement very seriously. They're passionate about it. So long answer to short question. This will be good.
Just a question about standby agreement. So, work on the disaster, on the disaster side of UNDP, and we have something called PDNA, post-disaster needs assessment. It's a consortium between the World Bank, the UNDP, or the UN, and the European Union. And we go out to communities after a disaster and try to map, what are the needs. And I was just thinking, if there's any discussions to have standby agreements with whether globally with your organization or with the local entities once they're formed, so that we after disaster we can deploy this technology to help us map the impact of a disaster and do our PDNAs.
That's a really, really good question. So UNICEF, WFP, asked us exactly the same question this time last year when we were just getting started with the labs. And said, listen, we can't commit to a standby agreement. We're a small team, the labs are not built yet. But now, we were in Myanmar with them a couple of weeks ago. That conversation came up again and said, yeah, for Nepal, Tanzania and Peru, and in fact, Yusuf has had requests in Uganda and DRC and Zimbabwe and Mozambique for the Tanzania Flying Lab as well. So there's a regional focus. So I think now is an appropriate time for those countries and Panama, Senegal, and hopefully the Pacific that'll come online next year or so, to start developing the agreements ahead of time. When UNDP or others need high quality aerial imagery analysis yesterday, the first responders by definition are the local communities, the local partners, and the local responders. So what we've done is build that local capacity so that you can actually tap into that expertise and get that data a lot faster. When we did this PDNA, I led a project with the World Bank after Cyclone Pen in Vanuatu in 2015 as part of the PDNA process. This was before we were robotics. It took us 2 weeks to get to Vanuatu to deploy. And then it took us like 5 days to start actually not only collecting imagery, but then being able to share it in the cloud because the connectivity issues were problematic. So you had about good 67 days between the cyclone hitting Vanuatu and us starting to generate information, which is in this time of day, like how is that still possible, right? We didn't build any local capacity. And in fact, the cyclone experience that was there that we left and we hadn't built it, that was one of really a catalyzing factor for a robotics type model. But now you have these flying labs in place, and regionally again, it's going to be easier to fly our Tanzanian lab, Khadija, to Ethiopia than it is to get an American drone company in Silicon Valley to fly over, and far cheaper. And Khadija actually is from the region; she knows a few things that Silicon Valley folks don't do not really. So yes, and more to that, by the way. What this may not be as of interest to UNDP, but just to reflect in the conversation with WFP, not only did they say they want a standby agreement so that they can draw on the rapid response of our flying labs teams within their countries and regionally, they also say there's a big gap in expertise and coordination of UAV assets and data collection and so on. And because we have that expertise, they're interested in actually potentially in some cases deploying my colleague Joel, who has 12 years of experience in disaster response, who's with Robotics now, deploying him to the disaster, and he plays a coordinating role, even if it's not anywhere near our flying labs with other UAV teams, because he already understands the UN, he understands the cluster system, he understands international disaster response, and can actually start maybe herding some cats in a meaningful way and getting the data shared, analyzed, and dealing with any data privacy issues that might be. So that was interesting. It hadn't occurred to me until they brought this up a couple of weeks ago that they don't necessarily want our technology or the local capacity there. They want the coordination capacity. So, I mean, let's continue talking. I mean, this is why we're building these labs as well.
Okay, I think there was an excellent round of questions. Do we have any more? Yeah, go ahead. We'll take one last question.
This is a very simple question. All your projects in cooperation with the governments, and then also there are aircrafts flying, so there is need for approval, so that the drones do not collide.
Right.
So this is one of the concerns I do have. Yeah.
Most of our projects have a government actor involved. So like the Department for Land in Nepal has been involved in some projects with UTAM and company. In Peru, with the Ministry of Health. In Tanzania, it's the Ministry of Interior, and so on. So governments are often part of it because they're actually the ones where the information needs, and robotics can provide information in really unique ways. All our projects, we get formal written flight permissions, approvals from the respective aviation authorities in the different countries. So there's coordination that happens in so much about the coordination topic. So yeah, it's coordinated. There are regulations that say you cannot fly usually over 400 feet or 120 meters because that's where you have manned aircraft that fly from in terms of takeoff and landing. We can't fly within 5 kilometers of an airport unless we have written permission. We have literally flown 5 meters from an airport because we got permission. In fact, when we were in Peru a few weeks ago, we had to fly from the northern part of the town to a remote village south. And that meant crossing the international runway, the international airport, because otherwise we have to go all around, and then the flight is problematic with batteries. So we actually coordinated directly with air traffic control. And thankfully, it's not London Heathrow or JFK. There may be a dozen flights a day. So they were basically saying, okay, between 2 and 5 p.m., do whatever you want. You can fly, but before that and after that, we don't want any drones, and that's exactly what we did. So it's just a matter of coordination. We did the same thing in Vanuatu with the Australian Defence Force and the air traffic control. The coordination is required, especially in disaster context where you do have cargo aircraft, military aircraft, and so on. So that's an expertise that we've also developed in the process. It's a good question. It's important. Safety.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Thanks very much for all the questions. I think it was a really good introduction for some of us into this topic. Some of us have been looking at some of the issues. I had a lot of questions myself, and maybe we'll take them offline about, both about the technology, how we do on payload these days. Where is that curve taking us, as well as the regulatory environment. And I think it's important you mentioned that, sir, because outfits like UNDP that work closely on capacity building with governments have a real opportunity to work on that enabling environment. I don't know if our niche as an organization is around flying drones. There's obviously other outfits that are much more nimble and able to bring the technology at a lower cost. But we have a comparative advantage when we work with these governments to set up the environment so that looking ahead to the next crisis, because if you're doing on a if there's no emergency, so to speak, going on, that's probably okay. You can manage it like you said, talking to the airport. So all of a sudden you have a number of NGOs flying into Nepal, wanting to deploy their technology. Plus you have the cargo planes, and then nobody's going to get permission, and then things will come to a standstill. I think UNDP is in a good position to do that kind of disaster risk reduction management, thinking ahead of that and engaging with the authorities, bringing the best practices, helping draft bills that enable the uptake of the technology. Also think our colleague from Global Pulse touched on a very important point here. The technology moves very rapidly. There's a lot of excitement. Where I think we're still really lagging behind is on the data management and analytics capacity. And again, that's the area where a lot of the UN, including UNDP, but not just UNDP, can do a lot of support and capacity building. We have tons of data now. There's even like micro satellites, low orbiting, that do similar type data collection. But we still are not there in terms of the capacity of some of the governments to complement their statistics and the ability. So it's a fascinating topic, and it deserves a lot more time. But I'm very glad that Patrick could make the time and expose us to some of the things, some of the work. We certainly should be following up on the standby agreement type discussion going forward. That's really what the reason that we have this discussion and session is to share some of the knowledge that we have within the organization. So thanks very much, Patrick, again. Thank you all for coming.
Feel free to email me anytime, follow-ups, whether it's tomorrow or a year or 5 years. I'd love to stay connected. If I can be of service, please let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. It was
Thank you very much.
Real interesting.